If you spend much time trying to learn about rhetoric, nearly all roads will, as the saying goes, lead to Rome and then to Greece, where the word rhetoric originated. But if you've been following this series, you might already be realizing that whether we call it rhetoric or not, the capacity to use language and the practice of employing it for specific, often persuasive purposes is fundamentally human, and not just a set of cultural practices enshrined in a bunch of treatises from the ancient Mediterranean. So, as we enjoy our historical journey through the wide human world of rhetoric, I want to take some time to include insights from scholarship collected in the recent tome Global Rhetorical Traditions, and today we're taking a step off the roads that lead to Rome by visiting ancient China. As Wu points out, thousands of years ago, China started its own rhetorical tradition almost in parallel to, if not earlier than, ancient Greece. But of course, the cultural and political contexts of Greece and China were very different. First, unlike rhetoric in ancient Athens, who usually spoke in public, persuaders in ancient China had to convince the single-person audience, the ruler or a superior, often in a private setting and sometimes at life risk. At the time, Wu goes on to note, kings needed highly skilled, learned men to provide advice on political, diplomatic, and military strategies. In response, almost all learned men who wished to move upward socially tried to master rhetorical strategies in order to be hired by the kings. Accordingly, Chinese educational systems aimed to prepare such learned men to win imperial appointments. Where Greek rhetoric emerged as a way to persuade voting citizens in early democracy, Chinese rhetoric emerged as a way to persuade kings in times of warfare and upheaval. But in both cases, educational programs arose that put rhetoric, the practice of speaking and writing to persuade, at their respective centers. Now, before we get into it, as always, just a reminder that A, we're interested in the big rhetorical picture. It's neither possible nor our purpose to get into all the details of history or culture or philosophy. So just as we looked at what Aristotle had to say about rhetoric, but not all of Aristotle's philosophy, we'll be looking, for example, at what Confucius had to say about discourse, not everything Confucius had to say. And B, I know very little about ancient Greek and Latin, but I do know enough to know that Cicero was almost certainly not how Cicero's name was actually pronounced at the time, and I know even less about ancient Chinese phonology. So let's just realize that the only reason that Cicero doesn't sound like the outrageous mispronunciation that it is because we're used to it. But speaking of Confucius, let's get on to the good stuff.
You know, bud, you might get more views if you just started with the good stuff.
Yeah, and I might get more views if I didn't choose to talk about the history of rhetoric, but this is the life we're living. Anyway, as Lon notes, Confucius lived at a time when royal power was waning, creating conditions wherein marginalized individuals, whose lineages were unrelated to royalty or state rulers, gained upward mobility. And with the rise of this new class of state officials, there were suddenly many more voices involved in interpreting the cosmic order, or Tianming, and its implications for society. Indeed, Lan writes, debating about Tianming in such socially and politically volatile times would require skills of effective expression to and persuasion of one's audience. However, it would also require the ability to form probable judgments and interpretations of Tianming in particular circumstances with one's audience. So do you see the rhetoric? We've got it all. Audiences, persuasion, adapting ideals and philosophies to real practical circumstances. Obviously, those ideals and cultural values were different from many of the schools of philosophical thought from the Mediterranean, but the practices and priorities are still recognizably rhetorical. And in that context, Confucius arose as a teacher of rhetoric, committed to helping his students become good state officials. One of the key ideas in Confucius's approach to rhetoric was that of using language to invent or articulate probable knowledge. And again, that's a fundamentally rhetorical idea. If we think about the debates in Greece about whether rhetoric was an art or not, the complaint against rhetoric was often that it did not pursue truth as philosophy did. But the practical reality was and is that rhetoric just concerns itself with different kinds of truth. Rhetoric is interested in the practical, the contingent, and the probable, and Greek rhetors used the term kairos to identify those opportune moments for rhetorical intervention. While Plato was writing his dialogues about the superiority of philosophy to rhetoric, Confucius was teaching about the rhetorical means whereby people could live the high principles of the cosmic order in everyday life. Discourse, in other words, was not a suspect counterfeit of truth, but in real rhetorical fashion, a way to adapt ideals to messy realities. For example, as we read in the Analects, a collection of Confucius's sayings, when words can accomplish what they are meant to accomplish, They are good enough. And in that, I read a thoroughly pragmatic approach to discourse. The goal is to get things done with language, as much for Confucius as for any Western rhetorician. But it's also just good advice for writers. I know so many writers who have a hard time even getting started because they fear they won't be able to create something perfect. Well, what did Confucius say about what makes for quality writing? First of all, that words need to do what they are meant to do, and that the standard is good enough, not perfect. In my own teaching, for example, the standard is not to write the most impressive argument I've ever read. It's to write an argument that is reasonably supported by sound evidence. But again, it gets to the practicality of rhetoric that's reflected in Confucius's approach. The goal is to understand and apply truth, the cosmic order, making sound arguments for how that truth should be interpreted and implemented. And accordingly, Confucius teaches effective rhetorical practice as well. At the state court, the master spoke to lower officials amiably and joyously, and he spoke with higher officials justly and candidly. On the arrival of the duke, he acted with respect and poise. Or in rhetorical terms, we could translate it like this: know your audience and address them accordingly. The master said, those who gather together day in and day out, not speaking with kairos, but showing off their cleverness at resorting to trickery, this kind of people are difficult. What is rhetoric? Not just verbal display and empty manipulation, but substantive persuasion tailored to the situation. The master said, I don't know if one who has no credibility can accomplish much. Can carriages, big or small, work without the linchpin connecting the wheel axle and the crossing shaft? Did somebody order a side of ethos?
I know someone who should.
We could keep going. The point is that even in different places, under different circumstances, ideas and practices that are instantly recognizable as rhetorical were finding their expression in the teachings of Confucius as much as in the teachings of Aristotle. Though, as Lon notes, Aristotle's approach is more analytical. He studies rhetoric as a thing that can be examined, while Confucius's approach does not focus on that technical aspect of rhetoric so much as to approach rhetoric as a part of the art of life. And that integration of life and rhetoric finds a pretty straightforward expression in the work of Xunzi, who describes the concept of the Junzi, which, as Wu explains, is an exemplary rhetor who follows what is proper in a rhetorical situation according to the Confucian orthodoxy. The exemplary person is, therefore, independent to develop his mind and capability of speech through learning rights and morality. And it wouldn't be surprising if you heard echoes of Quintilian's idea that the orator is a good man speaking well. But like Quintilian, Xunzi doesn't just lay out high moral standards for practitioners of rhetoric, he also outlines principles for effective speech. He writes all the difficulties of persuasion reside in talking about lofty causes to advance the low class and talking about ideal states to address chaos. They are outright unachievable. Illustrations without immediate relevance are considered disconnected. Down-to-earth ones are considered tasteless. Good persuaders situate themselves in the middle. They can illustrate the lofty without sounding disconnected and the practical without sounding unrefined. They move and walk with times. They lower themselves to see the world as it is. So, carrying on the Confucian idea of rhetoric serving to interpret and apply ideal states to real life, Xunzi describes an exemplary speaker as someone who can work from the middle, someone who's as comfortable working with ideals as with practicalities. Like any rhetorician, the Junzi he describes is able to hold lofty ideals and adapt to real circumstances while speaking persuasively. And how do they speak? Well, Xunzi puts it like this: the Junzi deliberates and plans in advance. His speech is concise but pleasant to the ear, rhetorically composed with credibility, profound knowledge, and righteousness. This is the argument by a good man, or the Junzi. And Xunzi also gives us insight into why such a speaker is needed. Nowadays, sage kings are all dead. The world is in chaos and treacherous eloquence arises. The Junzi has no authority to govern people. There is no punishment to deter them. This is why he is engaged in differentiation and persuasion. And he goes on to explain that the Junzi works to identify and name reality and to promote agreement about reality through persuasion. And eloquence, he says, delineates the names of different types of reality, in a turn that sounds an awful lot like some of the 20th century rhetorical theory that arose in the US and which we'll get to eventually. But from Xunzi, we turn our attention to Hanfeizi, one of Xunzi's students, who, as Wu points out, wrote treatises to criticize ministers and persuaders who he believed beguiled lords and people to gain their own advantages and benefits. We mentioned it at the beginning, but Hanfeizi describes more explicitly the unique rhetorical situations of ancient China. Instead of giving speeches in legislative assemblies, practitioners in China were giving speeches to individual rulers, and Hanfeizi acknowledges the unique risks and opportunities that come with that kind of rhetoric. He writes, generally speaking, the difficulties of persuasion are not that I do not know the facts needed to persuade others, nor is it that I have no reasoning ability to make myself understood, nor is it that I do not have the audacity to exercise my persuasive power to the fullest. The difficulties of persuasion, on the whole, reside in reading the mind of the audience and in choosing persuasive words. And that's just it, isn't it? If we had to boil rhetoric down to its essence, the challenges of understanding an audience and choosing persuasive words are probably where we'd land, whether we followed Aristotle there or Hanfeizi.
Much easier just to literally read minds, though, don't you think?
I mean, I know you talk about that, but is it something you really do?
You better believe it, bud. I'm reading and recording your thoughts right now.
Oh, really? Well then, why don't you share what you've learned?
Oh, you really don't want me to do that. Well, maybe at the end if everyone behaves themselves.
Okay then, I guess we'll see. But back to the matter at hand, since the rhetorical contexts of ancient Greece and ancient China are different, the applications of general rhetorical principles must also look different in practice. So, unlike Aristotle, Hanfeizi spends time warning persuaders that if they let on that they know too much about their superior's secret plans, or let other wise men know about their own plans, or fail to develop a closeness with the superior or any number of other blunders, the persuader's life is in danger. Pragmatically then, Hanfeizi writes that the business of persuasion is about knowing how to polish a speech, to dignify what a superior is proud of, and to play down what he is ashamed of. And I can understand why you might, platonically minded person that you are, find that to be troubling advice. Are we just talking about ingratiating ourselves to people in power and playing to their whims? Well, no. Remember, Hanfeizi criticized officials who used rhetoric for their own benefit. The goal is to adapt the lofty ideals of wise government and cosmic order to the realities of different rulers' personalities. Sure, it would be great to have a fully virtuous ruler who only would act through the highest of motives, but Xunzi wrote that the sage kings were all dead, so rhetors would have to deal with the kings they had, and not the kings they wish they had. For example, Hanfeizi says, if you wish to propose a policy of peaceful coexistence, be sure to name and clarify it in honorable words, and imply that it satisfies his personal interests as well. In other words, pursue a policy of peaceful coexistence because it's the right thing and the ideal thing to do. But it also makes a lot of sense to make it sound like something the ruler would be personally interested in too. This isn't about abandoning truth any more than it was in ancient Greece. It's about recognizing that different things will motivate different people, and it's useful to know how to motivate powerful people to make beneficial decisions. And if you're not fully persuaded, Hanfeizi provides an ethical check or a pattern for accountability on the part of both the persuader and the persuaded. He explains, if persuaded by a speech without examining it, one has no way to hold a subordinate accountable. If a speech is not held responsible for its usefulness, then vicious speeches prevail. The master upholding the Tao examines a speech for its usefulness and studies its merit for reward. All words have consequences. Speeches are responsible for their usefulness. Speakers have the responsibility to make useful speeches that align with true ideals. And then listeners have the responsibility to examine speeches and make sure that they actually align with those ideals. If speakers and listeners don't do their respective jobs, to speak responsibly and listen critically, well then we shouldn't be surprised if things fall apart. But as with all our historical journeys on this show, there's always so much more that we could say. A little sampling of rhetorical theory and practice from a specific time and place could never do justice to all the history, culture, and human living that surrounded those rhetorical practices. But I started this series based on the experience I had learning about the history of rhetoric for the first time. It was exciting to me, not because I was learning about the history and culture of Rome, but because in rhetoric, I saw explanations for how people work. Understanding rhetoric is a way to understand people, their motives, their actions, and the ways that they use language. And, of course, it's a way to understand how we can use language in more meaningful and humane ways, too. And broadening our scope to include more than just the so-called Western rhetorical tradition helps us to see that whether we call it by that name or not, Rhetoric is at the heart of how we deal with each other as humans, and it has long held a central place in our cultures, governments, and educational systems, from the ancients to every corner of the world. So maybe it's just me, but it seems strange that we don't talk about it more. The principles of persuasion, of understanding an audience, a situation, and the words that will make a difference, are so useful and adaptable that they can find application in the Roman Senate and the courts of Chinese rulers. So, of course, they can also find application in our ever unprecedented times as well. And that's really what I want to show you in this series. I'm not here just to show you some cool rhetorical theory and historical curiosities, but to make the case for rhetoric as a powerful but much neglected force for good. So thank you for joining me this far on our shared quest to save the world with rhetoric, and come back soon for more good stuff to come.
Hey, do you want to hear what he's thinking? Well, here we go.